After the October Revolution saw the rise of Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks to power, many anti-Bolshevik and separatist armies rose up in opposition to the new socialist government. They carved out large swathes of territory, leaving the new government with comparatively little of its own in return. This, combined with the interventions from the Entente powers in support of the White Armies, as well as the further potential for encroachment on their territory by the Central Powers, could lead someone to think that the Reds had no chance in winning this civil war. But 5 years later, the Red Army would go on to dominate most of the former Russian Empire and crush the White movement into obscurity. But how did they do this? And what did the Reds have that the Whites didn't? Well, in this video, we'll be looking at why the Reds won the Russian Civil War. There were multiple factors that bolstered the Bolshevik war effort and hampered the efforts of the White Army to stop that war effort in its tracks. In fact, you could almost say that
the game was rigged from the start
for the Whites. Let's start with geography. Even though on the map the Whites and Separatists controlled a much greater land area, most of Russia's industrialized areas and biggest cities were in Russia's heartland, which was dominated by the Reds. Having the biggest cities meant having a larger population, allowing Bolshevik leaders like Leon Trotsky to conscript large numbers of people into the Red Army, as opposed to the Whites, who controlled the more sparsely populated areas of Russia. It also meant that the Reds controlled the majority of Russia's factories, giving them the means to produce enough weapons and supplies to sustain the Red Army. But having all these troops and weapons at your disposal doesn't mean as much if you can't get them to the front. That's where the rail network comes in. Moscow wasn't just the capital of Bolshevik Russia, it was also their main railway hub, and because their area of control was smaller and more connected, coordination was easier. The Whites, on the other hand, mainly relied on the Trans-Siberian Railway, as well as less developed rural roads for troop movement. Next is how the Entente nations of World War I intervened on behalf of the White Army. You would think that this would boost the White Army's chances, and with the weapons and equipment that was supplied to them it initially did. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks used the presence of foreign troops to argue that Russia was being invaded, the Whites had become their collaborators, and the Reds were the only ones who could defend the motherland. This would increase popular support for the Bolsheviks among their core territories, such as in the cities. Another thing about the Entente's intervention was that it ended up being a bit half-hearted. While they were indeed deeply concerned about the spread of communism, one of the main motivations for intervening in the Civil War was to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany as a part of World War I, since the Russians had dropped out after the revolution. Once the war ended, and the Bolsheviks failed to conquer Poland in the Polish-Soviet War, Entente support for the White Army would dissipate. One Entente member, Japan, even decided to invade the Far East with the intentions of taking territory and setting up a buffer between themselves and Bolshevik Russia. And since the regional White Army seemed complicit in this plan, it played into the invasion narrative that Lenin had created. Another reason that the Reds won was their generally superior discipline and leadership. For example, Leon Trotsky was a ruthless yet competent wartime leader. He was able to organise the Red Army into an effective fighting force and greatly raised morale among his troops and generals by any means necessary. After all, if ideology couldn't motivate you, then perhaps the fear of your family being taken hostage and executed if you failed or stepped out of line would. Another example was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who managed to quickly defeat Admiral Kolchak's forces in 1919, taking huge portions of Siberia, sealed the fate of the White Army in Crimea, crushed the Kronstadt and Green Army rebellions, and almost conquered Poland, but not quite. Still, there was a reason why he had the nickname Red Napoleon. While the White Russians did have some of the most skilled and capable generals of the entire war, people like Denikin and especially Wrangel come to mind, these people were outnumbered by generals and leaders who weren't as good, to put it lightly. These people behaved more like the Tsarist generals of old, were often disloyal and were usually fighting for personal glory instead of a common cause. When it came to the troops, Red Army soldiers were generally considered to be tightly disciplined. In contrast, White Army troops were more corrupt and unmotivated, and White Army desertion rates were much higher as well. The Reds seemed to enjoy more popular support among the population than the Whites did, especially in the cities. The Bolsheviks presented a clear vision to the Russian people, one that was rooted in the revolutions of 1917 and in slogans like peace, bread, and land. Urban workers and soldiers sought to protect the progress and reforms made after 1917, and they believed that unless a Red Army victory was assured, then Russia would be doomed to revert back to being the Tsarist Empire. Some nationalist and separatist groups also believed that this was the case as well, which is why a lot of them thought that supporting the Red Army could at least give them more autonomy. It also helped that the Bolsheviks had a precedent for letting some of Russia's former imperial territories gain independence. But they also had a precedent for trying to stop other areas from gaining independence too. So there's that to consider. While the peasantry did hate the Bolsheviks, they hated the whites much more, because at least Lenin had promised them land, while they knew, with the whites, they would have no chance of getting that land as long as they were promising the return of their former landlords. So, despite the policy of war communism effectively turning the peasantry into employees of the state, who had to hand over their grain to the Cheka to be used in food for the urban workers and military, and could be executed by the Cheka for not handing their grain over to them, they saw that as preferential to being financially indebted to their former landowners, like they were under the Tsarist Empire. Finally, and possibly the biggest reason for the Reds' victory in the Civil War, was the White Movement's own disunity. Even though I've been referring to the White Army and the White Movement as a single group, in reality, the Whites were a collection of several different armies, militias and separatist groups who had conflicting interpretations of what a post-war Russia would look like. For instance, some people would have wanted to continue the Russian Republic that was set up in the wake of the February Revolution. Some wanted to restore the Tsar and bring back the Russian Empire. Some groups may have wanted to bring autonomy or independence for their own people, and were only allied with the Whites to stop the Reds from taking over. You get the idea. White Army commanders often distrusted each other, sometimes to the point of turning their own troops against each other. This was in contrast to the Red Army, who had a much more unified and centralised command structure, which made it that much easier for the Red Army to come in and bowl everyone over. So to summarise, the Reds were able to win the Civil War due to multiple factors, such as how they used the geography of Russia's heartland to their advantage, leveraged the Entente intervention to be used as a part of their propaganda to increase popular support, and used their well-disciplined troops and higher amount of skilled generals and leaders to take advantage of the White Movement's own disunity. White Army and separatist insurgencies would continue at a smaller scale well into the 1920s, but by June 1923, the Russian Civil War was practically over, and the Soviet Union was born.